keep being presented with this false dichotomy, this idea that it's a choice between one of two options. Either we open up and millions of people die from the virus, or we stay shut down and millions of people die from poverty and food insecurity and all the rest of it. This is a false dichotomy. It doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be neither. And I hope to demonstrate this in this video. I already did a live stream on it, but I thought I'd get more traction on this channel, more of an audience. Now, hopefully, you follow me, you know me a little bit, you know that I don't just pull arguments out of my arse. Right? I have a grounding, an educated grounding in history and politics and the history of politics. And ideologically, I'm an anarchist, which means I'm inclined towards freedom. I want the greatest amount of freedom for the greatest number of people. So I'm someone who does not agree with impositions or censorship or unnecessary laws or punishment, keyword being unnecessary. But what seems to confuse people is that I'm also a pragmatist, which means that ideological goal, that platonic ideal of voluntarist, mutualist anarchism is what guides me. It's not what I think necessarily fits the situation in which we find ourselves at any particular time, right? I don't know why this confuses people, but it does. And because I'm a pragmatist, I tend to gravitate towards ideological and economic solutions that guarantee the greatest freedom for the greatest number of people. I don't allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good. So that's why I tend to gravitate towards what I call socialism and what you may well call welfare capitalism. Call it what you like, fill your boots. I think the best example of a society that grants the greatest amount of freedom, the greatest amount of social mobility, all the rest of it, I think the greatest living societies that demonstrate that are the Scandinavian democracies, right? That's why I advocate for that kind of what I call socialism and you might call welfare capitalism. Now, anarchism differs from libertarianism in that it tends to be voluntarist and community-minded rather than individualist and everyone out for their own in a more sort of Randian objectivist sort of way. But hopefully you also know that I am fairly consistently skeptical, that I am tempered by that pragmatism, and that I don't take up positions without having really thought them through. Now in this I'm mostly going to be drawing on UK numbers. I'm more familiar with them. I consider them more reliable than those available from a lot of other nations. I don't tend to do citations because nobody bothers to check them, and I want to encourage you to do your own research. So take this as a starting point, okay? The crux of the argument here seems to be that the shutdown is going to kill more people than the virus would have or will do at this point, and that therefore we should lift the lockdown and let lots and lots of people die of the virus, because that really seems to be it. The idea that more people will be killed by us closing down the economy than ever would from the virus, or at least would now from the virus, forgetting that we don't have any massive amount of immunity at this point, and so just starting everything up again will just lead to the virus spreading massively rapidly again. So the choice I keep being presented with by certain people is that either we kill millions with the shutdown or we kill millions with the virus. But this is a false dichotomy. These are not the only two choices. Tentatively, the mortality rate of the virus is somewhere between 2 and 5%. Most organisations with any kind of authoritative science behind them are saying that it's 3 and a bit. So let's call it 3%. And the infectivity rate is about 60%. So if we had done absolutely nothing using these revised statistics, In the UK, we would have had about 2 million deaths, all told, by the time this is done. That provides us a ballpark of what's acceptable to sacrifice in other circumstances in order to prevent that. This doesn't, however, take into account that there's a lot of other effects from the coronavirus, long-term effects on people's breathing and health, damage to organs, long-term medical care through physio, increased vulnerabilities, lung damage, and all the rest. This is just deaths, okay? So it's not by any means the whole story, which is something that people seem to be leaving out of the equation as well. 2 studies in the UK placed unnecessary deaths as a result of our austerity policy of the last decade at about 150,000 over 10 years. So there's about 15,000 unnecessary deaths per year. So that gives us a kind of ballpark of what more austerity and poverty would do in terms of deaths. And as you can tell, one of those numbers is a hell of a lot higher than the other. Indeed, even with all our mitigation efforts and so on, we've still had about 30,000 official deaths and about 60,000 unofficial deaths due to coronavirus already, and it's only about halfway through the year. So even if we do accept the grim calculus of deaths versus deaths, then clearly the shutdown is far and away the better option of the ones that we've been presented with. That's not really even a question at that point. Now, the United Nations has suggested that maybe 150 million people globally could die from the economic impact and downturn. And it's also true that unfought, from older estimates, about 90 million people would have died globally if we hadn't taken the steps we did to fight the virus. With the updated fatality and infectivity statistics, about 228 million would have died globally. So again, if we just compare like for like, which we don't even have to, but clearly the shutdown is the better option of the two. But that was if we did nothing. Those are the deaths from the coronavirus if we did nothing to mitigate and fight it. And those are the deaths from poverty, from the economic downturn, if we did nothing to fight it. And then we can do things to fight it, and those things don't have to be exposing our populations wholesale to the novel coronavirus. These aren't the only 2 options available. Previous experience with previous pandemics and similar disasters suggest that there will be a fairly rapid recovery from COVID once we can open up. But this is only really possible after a vaccine, which will likely take 18 months to be ready to be rolled out to everybody. So if we go back to the austerity statistics from the UK, that would be about 22,000 deaths, while we sit around twiddling our thumbs waiting for a vaccine. That's not actually how things are likely to work out, but that gives us a kind of ballpark figure. And again, even if we take the lower band of official statistics, we've already lost 30,000 people. So again, if we have to make this death-for-death comparison, the shutdown is still far and away the better option of the 2. Now, a lot of these potential deaths are from poverty, are due to food poverty, starvation, suicide, uselessness, and so on. But psychologically, this is not the same as just losing your job, being useless, being dead weight to society. It's a different psychological impact. There is a massive event that's outside of your control. If you've lost your job, it's not through any fault of your own. This all has a very different psychological impact. And in fact, by staying home and not doing anything, you're helping. So this doesn't have anything like the same kind of devastating effect on people's psychology that is normally associated with this. So while we'd like to see some uptick in suicides, it's not going to be anything like the number of people who would be dying from the coronavirus if we weren't fighting it. So this is less like regular joblessness, and it's more like a war in which there's a draft or something. You leave your job behind, you go off and you do your duty, right? Except in this case, your duty consists of sitting at home in your pants and playing Xbox or PlayStation or whatever, right? It's It's a very different psychology. And there is no need for anyone to starve in the midst of plenty. We still have plenty of food. Supply chain and agricultural workers are already designated essential workers. They should be getting PPE and better advice and protection and all the rest of it, that they're not, but they should, but they're already designated essential workers. So we have the food is still being produced, we have the people to take the food to places where it is needed. Where is it breaking down? And the breakdown is market economics, capitalism. People don't have the money to buy the food. Now, in theory, that would mean that the price of food would drop through the floor. But that's not the case, is it? Because past a certain point, it's not worth them producing it. These are not normal conditions. These are not market conditions. These are disaster conditions. And if people are starving in the midst of plenty, then clearly laissez-faire free market capitalism can't cope with this kind of situation, is maladapted to this kind of situation, and however temporarily, we need to look into other solutions. And it's not like we haven't done this before. Right? The problem is not food, the problem is not getting the food to people, the problem is money. But people seem to be so utterly stuck and rooted in neoliberal, much as I hate that term, free market capitalist economics, that they cannot even conceive of another way to do things. It's all a bit 1984. People don't have the language to understand or to grasp that this isn't the only way to do things, that there are other ways to do things. So if free market capitalism cannot cope, then it's not a suitable system in this time and place to cope with this disaster. This doesn't mean we abandon it all and completely embrace Marxism, which I don't advocate for anyway, but we do have past models, such as rationing, for example, during the World Wars, right? We distributed food and necessities outside of the market paradigm while still remaining a broadly speaking capitalist democratic society. It was an emergency condition, it was a temporary state of affairs, and it worked. It worked so well, in fact, that many nations embraced the idea of centralized command economies in the post-war era. Now that didn't go as well, but obviously, of course, that wasn't the same situation, so little wonder. But the point is that it worked in and during the crisis. It stopped people starving. In fact, a lot of people got a lot healthier during the war due to the way in which the ration worked. So we could institute some form of rationing. Those who could afford to pay for food and so on should continue to do so. Those who can't, well, we already, unfortunately, have a massive network of food banks, so why not have the government step in, buy up the supply that the supermarkets and so on cannot, and supply those to food banks to ensure that people who are insecure in terms of their food supply can get enough to get by, at least until the crisis abates. See, this is why it's a false dichotomy. We don't have to expose any more than the bare minimum necessary number of people to the virus, and we don't have to let people starve. It's an entirely artificial imposition. Of course, the question once all this is past is, why don't we make these efforts all the time? If during a massive health crisis we can find the will and the money to house the homeless, to feed the poor, to do all of these other things, why don't we continue to do so in our normal circumstances? But that's an argument for another time. The point is right now that this is a false dichotomy. It's not either or, right? We can keep people safe, we can keep people fed, and the one does not have to be at the expense of the other, nor does it mean we have to cast everything aside and become communist. It just means that an emergency situation requires some different thinking, some different ways of doing things. Yeah, and we can pay for it later with taxation or whatever else we need. It doesn't inevitably lead to hyperinflation. Right? You do what you need to do. And during the war, this was considered all patriotic. Farmers would continue to produce food for the effort. People would continue to distribute it for the effort. People would make do with less for the effort, for the sake of the nation. And if you think of this in war terms, this fight against this virus, as a total war situation, then these other options, these other ways of doing things, I think might finally penetrate people's brains. This whole thing is personal to me as well. You know, I try to be objective and distanced, but it's hard when these things directly affect you. I have very shitty lungs. I had childhood asthma, lots of courses of steroids and all sorts of things, which means my lung capacity is only about 80 to 90% of a normal person in my state of fitness and everything else, which is not particularly good either. I also have allergies and issues that can constrict my breathing on top of any other problems. If there's a chest infection or something going around, odds are I'm going to get it, and it's going to affect me a lot worse than a lot of other people. So I'm high risk, which means that when you say we should open up, you're effectively saying, Grim, you need to die. You know, I can't put up with this any longer. I need a haircut and some hot pockets, and if you have to die for my convenience, then so be it. Right? It's hard not to take that personally, right? I have friends who are immunocompromised due to their battles with cancer. My parents are getting older. A friend of mine who was already disabled has caught the virus. Fortunately, they beat it, but they've suffered some additional permanent damage in the aggravation of their various disabilities. You know, you're not just saying my right to a haircut or to go to work is worth deaths. You're saying you, Grim, you can die so that I can look fabulous on Instagram. Right? You can die for a billionaire's bottom line. Well, I am not prepared to do that for you. You know, the right to swing your fist ends at the tip of my nose. Your right to spread disease ends at my lungs. Right? You don't have a right to gun down whoever you want, and you don't have a right to spread your disease to whoever you want, willy-nilly, without a care in the world. Right? This isn't purely a choice that's yours, because it necessarily impacts on the community around you. So in that sense, this is like anti-vaccination people. Right? It's not just a choice for you and your child, however ill-informed that choice is, because you affect herd immunity. You put other children who cannot get vaccines for whatever reason at risk. Right? This elevates to the level of the harm principle. So in this instance, it's one of the very few rare incidents where I would say censorship is justified, where David Icke should be taken off the air, where anyone blaming it on 5G or saying that it's an engineered virus or perpetuating racist attacks on Chinese people because they blame them for the virus, these people should be censored, arrested, everything else. Anti-vaxxers should be overridden, they should be driven offline, they should be censored because it rises to the level of the harm principle, which is the only means to justify this kind of thing. So this is one of those rare incidents where I believe something directly rises to the level of harm, because people are dying and people are going to die as a result of other people's selfishness and disregard. Now, this presents me with something of a problem also, personally. I do a podcast called Inappropriate Characters with Venture Satanis and the RPG Pundit, and the Pundit has been particularly vociferous in that everything should open up and that the virus isn't as bad as people are saying, and that this is, and he supports this false dichotomy. Do I want to share a platform with someone who takes that position? I don't believe he's racist, which he's often painted as. I don't believe he's sexist, which he's often painted as. Most of the time we disagree, but I don't mind being the dissenting voice. But I wouldn't want to share a platform, certainly not regularly, with someone who is a vaccine denier. And this is morally equivalent. Dangerously irresponsible, will lead to deaths. I cannot support it. Plus it affects me personally. So I don't know what I'm going to do there. But it shows how it affects me personally. I don't want to be a hypocrite. I have to do the right thing. I'm not sure what the right thing is in this circumstance, but I need to think about it, whether I want to continue doing that, because I cannot be alongside or seem to support someone who advocates for such a dangerous path of activity that will lead to thousands, if not millions, of unnecessary deaths. It's just not in me to do it. It's wrong. It's objectively wrong. It's dangerous. It's murderous. The same as anti-vaccination is. So I have to figure out what I'm going to do there. But this is a false dichotomy. We don't have to expose people unnecessarily to the virus, and we don't have to let people starve. We don't have to do either. The UN number of 150 million, that's a warning, just as we were warned about the virus. And we've managed to mitigate that with varying degrees of success, and we can do the same when it comes to poverty, whether it's in our own country or abroad. The food is still there. We just need to find another means than the market to distribute it, just to get people by until we can get things back to normal, or better than normal. So don't come at me with this argument, because it's simply false. You just have to do a little bit of out-of-the-box thinking. Sang.